teenager. This might come as a shocker to some of you, but I was not the most popular kid in school. And I'm just naturally a little bit more quieter of a person. And so I always had my small group of like close friends, but I was never that person that like everybody wanted to be friends with. And I wasn't the class clown or anything like that, except whenever I would pull out a pack of gum. All right. And then everybody wanted to be my friend, right? Everybody wants some gum. And out of nowhere, people would be like, hey, can I get a piece? Hey, Ryan, you got any more gum? Hey, Ryan, you got any more? Come on. Can I get one? Can I get one? And then what would happen is I'd have like nothing left here. Just take the whole thing. Why not? And so opening a pack of gum was this thing that made all these people who never said a word to me ever suddenly want to be my best friend. And I had to learn that if I actually wanted gum for myself or not have to say no to everybody, I'd have to like secretly pull it out and like open it underneath my desk, right? And try to like slip a piece without anybody finding out. And obviously those people weren't interested in me. They were only interested in what I had to offer them. And nowadays, it's not only gum, but we do this with, hey, can I borrow a phone charger? I'm on 1%. Or a Netflix password or a hotspot, right? And we live in a world where relationships are transactional. We've probably all had a message from someone who we haven't talked to in a decade, and they're like, hey, how are you doing? And then 2 messages later, it's like, by the way, I'm starting my own business, and I would love if you would go like my page and share it and, give us a follow or whatever, right? And again, this is a natural part of being human, is relationships tend to become transactional. And while it's not always a bad thing, the danger is that we can begin to bring that same mentality into our relationship with God. And this morning, I want us to kind of wrestle through a challenging and for me convicting question. Would you ask yourself this morning, do I love God or do I love what God gives me? And this morning, as we continue in our series called Powerful Prayers, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 33, and we're going to find Moses in a situation where he could have easily viewed God through this transactional lens. And he himself had to internally kind of wrestle with that question. A lot of us are probably familiar with the Exodus journey out of Egypt. God's people, the Israelites, they're being led by God through Moses, again, out of slavery and exile in Egypt to the promised land. And along their journey, they encounter lots of setbacks, but also miracles. And some of our favorite Bible stories as kids come in the book of Exodus. And so the Israelites, they experience like the parting of the Red Sea. They get to eat manna that came from heaven. They get to drink water from a rock. All of these incredible signs and wonders. And then Exodus 33, where we are going to be today, comes on the heels of actually perhaps Israel's darkest moment, the whole golden calf situation. A lot of us know that story as well. As much as the Israelites had experienced God's power and his provision and all these miracles, they still so quickly forgot. They got impatient. They got tired of waiting for Moses to come down from the mountain and meeting with God. And then they were like, we're not even sure if he's coming back. Like, we don't know what happened to him. And so they decided to make an idol for themselves in the form of a gold calf. Israel, they sinned. They clearly disobeyed God's commands. And so Moses, he has to go and he has to, on behalf of Israel, ask God for forgiveness and confess. And God deals with the sin and he strikes them with a plague. But now it seems like that journey and that situation is turning the page into something new. And as we move into Exodus 33, Moses gets from God perhaps the greatest offer anyone in the Old Testament ever receives. God is offering victory and provision, land, success, freedom, all the things that Moses and the Israelites have longed for and been waiting for 40 years plus. Would you imagine being Moses in this moment? Like, you spend the first 40 years of your life in captivity, enduring Pharaoh and the plagues. And then the last 40 years have been heading towards and building towards this moment here. Exodus chapter 33, verse 1. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey.'" This is it, right? Moses is like, all right, here we go. It's finally becoming time for the Israelites to enter the promised land. This is the best news, the best directive Moses has ever gotten from God. But, everybody say but. That's one of my favorite things to do. This is a big but here, all right? Verse 3, at the end of verse 3, God says this. He says, "But I will not go with you, because you are a stiff-necked people and I might destroy you on the way." So God tells Moses, he says, you can have the promised land. Here it is. It's yours. Go and take it. But I'm not coming with you. I'm not coming with you. And most of us, if we're being honest, would probably still take that deal. It's why this passage is so confronting. It's why that question I asked a moment ago is so hard. Because if we're honest, many of us would take God's blessings without God. We'd say, give me the marriage. Give me the healing. Give me the promotion. Give me the financial security, the successful kids, the comfortable life. These things are like our promised land. So think about it. If you traded places with Moses here, what would you have done? I don't like asking that question of myself. It's been a hard one to wrestle with. Would you agree to taking the promised land even if it meant forfeiting the presence of God? I think that most, if not all of us, have this tendency within us to desire God's promises more than his presence. Think about what you pray about the most. Ask yourself, what do I think about the most? What do I spend most of my time doing? What is my schedule devoted to, really? And again, if you think about those questions, if you're like me, you realize that we often treasure the gifts more than the giver. And at least a part of us desires what God can do for us more than God himself. And so when this happens, then what happens for us in our lives and in our faith is our faith becomes conditional. And our relationship with God becomes a transactional one. We start to pray only when we need something from God. Or most of our prayers are about what God can do for us or give us. We begin to see God as a resource rather than a father. But instead, our goal should be to have the same mindset and the same response as Moses. You guys want to talk about a powerful prayer? Look at what how Moses responds to God in verse 15. Exodus 33:15 says, "Then Moses said to him, 'If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here.'" Moses sees that little red blinking light in the box and says, "No deal. Don't send us. God, if you're not going, neither are we." Friends, we should aim to have that same mindset. We should be willing to pray that same type of prayer. To be so hungry for and dependent on the presence of God that we would give up everything for it and choose nothing over it. I think the main truth I want us to focus on this morning is that we need to choose God's presence over his promises. We need to choose God's presence over his promises. But let's be real. Most of us, we agree with that statement in our head. But few of us are really living it out and believing it in our heart. And so how do we get to a place where, like Moses, we can pray that powerful prayer? How can we get to a place where we can want God more than what God can do for us? And again, that's what I want us to focus on in our time together this morning. But first, I want to make sure that we have an accurate understanding of like what God's presence is. Because I would guess that in a room like this, when I say God's presence, there's probably like 100 different thoughts and images and ideas of what that phrase means. It's going to depend on your church background or how you were raised. And so to help create some clarity in the confusion, here's just a couple things to know about God's presence. First is that God's presence is more than a feeling. God's presence is more than a feeling. And today, man, we live in a world where so many worship services and experiences have like flashing lights and fog machines and big screens. And we write worship songs that are designed to tug at people's hearts and emotions. And in that, we have to be so careful to not equate or limit God's presence to a feeling. And Rick just talked about how our students are heading up to camp next weekend. And I know so many times where students, and even myself included, we would say, man, I just felt God's presence at camp. And yes, we can feel the Spirit of God working or in our heart or moving in a room. Yes, God does speak to us through a worship gathering or powerful songs or even through our feelings. And yes, God does frequently and genuinely uses camps and retreats and times away to move in the lives of his people. But we have to remember that his presence is far greater than a moment or a feeling. That God is so often working even when we don't feel it or we don't see it. That the presence or the absence actually of emotion does not equal the absence of God. And I believe that one of the greatest tests of our faith comes when the feelings fade away, when the worship music stops, when the tears stop flowing and the goosebumps are gone. Like in those moments, do we still choose God above everything else? God's presence is more than a feeling. Another thing we have to remember is that God's presence is not measured by his activity. His presence is not measured by his activity. People often confuse God's blessings with God himself. That God's presence is where there's evidence of him working and providing and healing and moving. And while those things are evidence of God's presence and activity, this is where the Israelites actually got it wrong. While Moses was meeting with God on the mountain, having this supernatural experience directly with the presence of God, the people of Israel, they couldn't see it. There was no activity of God around them directly in that time of about 40 days. And so they panicked and they abandoned God and made a God of their own. It revealed their real lack of faith in their hearts. Because you see, the Israelites, they loved what God could do, but Moses loved God himself. And just like feelings do not lead to a strong faith foundation, neither does simply experiencing God's activity. Israel had seen all those miraculous things. Remember, they'd seen the parting of the Red Sea. They had eaten manna from heaven. They had drank water from a rock. They had every reason to know and believe that their God was the one true God, but they still missed it. They still didn't get it. And in contrast, you have people in the Old Testament like Job and David who experienced incredible pain and loss and yet held firm in their faith. And so prosperity is not the measure of God's presence, contrary to what some false gospels might say. And I'd even go out on a limb and say that one of Satan's greatest strategies is maybe to allow us to experience prosperity. Why wouldn't the enemy want us to experience all the things of this world that distract us from our need for God, right? That compete in our heart for God's affection, or that compete with God for our affection. Friends, would you never fall for the lie that if you don't see or feel God working in your life, that means his presence isn't with you? That if life is good and I feel blessed, then that means that I'm good with God. And also don't believe the opposite lie, that if life is hard and all these things are happening to me, that means God has abandoned me or I've done something wrong. Neither of those are true, because God's presence is far more than his activity, and it is not measured by the circumstances of your life. We need to make sure that we rightly understand God's presence. And then we also need to know that God's presence is the ultimate gift. God's presence is the ultimate gift. Look at what the psalmist wrote in Psalm 84, verse 10. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this verse. The psalmist writes, "Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere." Better is one day in the presence of God than 1,000 anywhere else. God's presence is better than anything the world has to offer. That's the truth that Moses knew and lived out. See, all of us, we have things that we deeply desire in our hearts. For some of you, maybe it's a spouse. Maybe it's health and healing, financial security. Fill in the blank of whatever it is that you feel like you want or need most from God right now. Those things are great. They bring temporary happiness, but God's presence never fails. It cannot be taken from us. It is eternal, and it's the one thing that truly satisfies our soul. Moses knew this, and it's what led him to pray this powerful prayer. I once heard somebody pose the question, I don't remember who or where, but the question stands out. This person asked, if you could have heaven without Jesus, would you still want it? And at first, for me, that was like really convicting. And I understood the heart of the question and what this person was getting at. But then as I thought about it a little bit, I realized that it's kind of irrelevant, because heaven without Jesus isn't heaven. That the very thing that makes eternity with God so great is the with God part. That the beauty and the hope of heaven is the presence of Jesus. Jesus himself is the prize. And again, Moses knew this, and it allowed him to desire God's presence over everything. And God's presence, it changes everything. God's presence changes everything. Look at verse 16. Right after Moses says, no deal, we're not going to go if you're not going. Here's his reason why. He says, how will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? Moses knew that God's presence changes everything, and that it should have such an impact on our lives that it distinguishes us from everyone around us. That the people we work with and our neighbors and our friends and our family, they should notice that there's something different about us, that we as followers of Jesus have something that they don't have. And when we truly believe that God's presence is the best thing, when we consistently spend time in God's presence, when we surrender our lives to the will of God and we allow his Spirit to transform us, then what happens is God's presence becomes our filter. It becomes the lens through which we see our lives and our circumstances. It becomes the basis on which we make decisions. Can you imagine every decision, big decision in your life being run through this one question? Is God in this? Is God in this? Instead, a lot of times we make decisions based on like, will it pay more? Will people approve? Will it make me happy? Is it going to make my life easier? But rather, what if we started walking into every decision with confidence, knowing that God's presence was leading us into it? What if we approached our career, dating, that friendship, that opportunity, that move, that big decision, asking God, God, are you in this? Because when God's presence becomes the priority, his presence also becomes the filter. Imagine your prayers sounding a lot less like, God, would you bless my plans? And a whole lot more like, God, if you're not in it, then I don't want it. Just like Moses saying, if you're not going, then I don't want to go. God's presence changes everything. And if we ourselves are going to be transformed by the presence of God, then what we need to do is we need to start practicing the presence of God. We need to practice the presence of God. Moses was able to know the goodness and the power of God's presence by being in it. Moses had walked with God and talked with God and experienced God's presence in a deeper and more intimate way than any of us could ever imagine. And for us, even though we may not get to see the parting of a sea or a pillar of cloud of smoke or a fire or burning bush, the way that we still grow to love God's presence is by being in it. The more time we spend with God, the more we realize that it's the very thing our soul longs for. And it's the only thing that can satisfy the desires of our heart. And so we need to develop and maintain habits of being in and practicing God's presence. One of my favorite books is called The Practice of the Presence of God. It was written in the late 1600s by a guy named Brother Lawrence, who lived and worked in a French monastery. I know some of you guys have read this. But he wrote about how he learned to be in constant communion with God. Whatever he was doing, wherever he was, that even the most mundane things like washing dishes was an opportunity for him to have a conversation with God, to listen for God, to worship God. And in his book, Brother Lawrence writes this. He says, let us occupy ourselves entirely in knowing God. The more we know him, the more we will desire to know him. As love increases with knowledge, the more we know God, the more we will truly love him. We will learn to love him equally in times of distress or in times of great joy. Brother Lawrence says, the more we know him, the more we will desire to know him, the more we will love him. It is so important to spend time in the presence of God. But as I say that, I also want to be real with y'all, because especially in a room with so many parents of young kids, I've felt the tension of this. For so long, my time with Jesus could be what I wanted it to be. Like I could spend a 30-minute, hour block of time. I could get up early in the morning. I could read scripture. I could pray. I could listen. I could do worship music. I could journal. I could do all the things that it felt like I was supposed to do in my relationship with God, and it was great. Early morning was my time. Again, sometimes even late at night too. But then I had kids. And some of you feel that. Like, oh, I feel seen now. Thank you. And I got tired, like really tired. And I got busy, like really busy. And I found that my ability to have a 30-minute or longer block of time to just sit down with Jesus was nearly impossible. My kids would wake up at 5:45 a.m. I'm like, what am I supposed to do? Get up at 4? I'd be exhausted at every part of the day. And like 80% of the time when I'd close my eyes to pray, I'd fall asleep. Couldn't tell if I was praying or sleeping. I was probably sleeping. And I started to get really frustrated that this wasn't working the way it used to. I would feel guilty about not having this intimate, close relationship with God that I once had and desired. And so I had to learn a couple of things. I had to learn, one, that God's grace was there for the season of life I was in. Right? I had to let go of some of that guilt and know that that's okay. It's a season. And God gets it. Which, by the way, I'm not saying that's a pass and means that, spending time with Jesus is any less important. But then I also had to learn that I could practice God's presence throughout my day. That I could have an awareness of the presence of God, that I could have relationship with God as I was driving and doing dishes and cutting the grass and going for walks with or without my kids. That those could become times of practicing and being in the presence of God. And friends, your time with God doesn't have to look a certain way. If you feel that, if you're in that same season of life right now, know that it doesn't have to look a certain way. We don't need perfect conditions or a worship service or a chair pulled up on the beach to have a experience with God's presence. Moses met God in a tent. David met with God in caves. Daniel in exile. And Brother Lawrence while he was washing dishes. Friends, we have the presence of God everywhere we go. And the way we understand and experience the presence of God, thank goodness, is far different now than it was for Moses and the Israelites. They had the manifest presence of God, but we get to have the indwelling presence of God. Look at Exodus 33, verses 7 through 11. It says, "Now Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp. And whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people rose and they stood at the entrance to their tents, watching Moses until he entered the tent. As Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance, while the Lord spoke with Moses. Whenever the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance to the tent, they all stood and worshiped, each at the entrance to their tent. And the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend." The presence of God is a powerful thing. When God would speak with Moses, the Israelite people, they would all stand and worship. They would see this pillar of cloud and they would know that God was there. Friends, the powerful presence of God is not something to take lightly. When I say it's more than a feeling, I mean like a lot more than a feeling. When Moses encounters God's presence in the burning bush, God tells him to remove his sandals for he's standing on holy ground. When God came down on Mount Sinai, the people were instructed to stay back, and if they touched the mountain, that they would die. When God's presence his presence was often signaled by thunder and smoke and trumpets. And God's presence, when it was in the Holy of Holies in the temple, only the high priest could enter once per year and with a blood sacrifice. And then in the book of Acts, when the Spirit of God comes and is poured out on all the believers, he comes in the form of tongues of fire. Man, the presence of God is and always has been something that brings reverence and awe. It is holy and powerful. But now, because of Jesus, God's presence is with all of us. His Spirit dwells inside everyone who has made Jesus Lord of their life. And that same powerful, awe-inspiring, knock you on your face presence of God is with you wherever you go. 1 Timothy 6:16 says that God dwells in unapproachable light. And now because of Jesus, we don't have to take off our sandals. We don't have to bring a blood sacrifice. We don't need to tremble in fear. But the Bible says in Hebrews 4 that we can now approach God's throne with confidence because Jesus is our great high priest. Because his blood has granted us access to the power and the presence of God, that the unapproachable is now approachable. God's presence is no less holy or powerful than it was then, but the curtain of separation has been torn and the door has been opened to all of us. The holy God who once dwelled behind the curtain now dwells with his people. And God answered Moses' prayer and then some. Moses prayed, "We want your presence." And Jesus is the fulfillment of that powerful prayer. Moses said, "God, don't send us if you're not coming." And eventually God answered that prayer in a way Moses couldn't have imagined, because God didn't just send a cloud. He didn't just send an angel. He came. God put on flesh. Emmanuel, God with us. And then when Jesus left, he didn't leave us alone. He gave us his Spirit. The God Moses begged to go with him now lives within everyone who belongs to Jesus. And so the same way that God invited Moses into relationship, he now invites you and I into relationship. And so church, maybe the most powerful prayer that you could pray this week isn't, "God, give me this. God, fix this. God, I need this." Maybe it's simply, "God, I want you." More than the answer, I want the one I'm praying to. More than the promise, God, I want your presence. I believe that the most powerful prayers are the ones not asking for more gifts, but for more of God. The ones focused not on what we can get, but on how we can get to know him. The most powerful prayers are the ones focused not on a change of circumstances, but learning how to trust God in them. So Hill City, may we become people who don't simply want what God can do. May we have the faith of Moses, knowing the goodness and the power and the presence of God. May we choose his presence over his promises.